At 18 years old, Wayne Carlson entered prison for stealing cars. He could have become another forgotten name in the prison system. Instead, over the next several decades, he became known as one of North America's most persistent escape artists. Carlson escaped from custody 13 times, not from one single prison, as the title of this story sometimes suggests, but from different correctional institutions in Canada and the United States. His escapes ranged from improvised attempts to carefully planned breakouts, and some were so unusual that they later became part of his own memoir. But there was a strange pattern to Carlson's life. Every time he escaped, freedom was temporary. He would get away, he would disappear, then the authorities would find him. And eventually he would be back behind bars, facing an even longer sentence. Then he would try again. Wayne Carlson was born in Canada and grew up in a working-class environment. There was nothing about his early life that suggested he would eventually spend most of his adult years moving between prisons. But in 1960, when he was only 18, he was convicted of stealing cars. That conviction began a prison life that would stretch for decades. Carlson was first sent to Prince Albert Penitentiary in Saskatchewan. For a young man entering prison, the institution was supposed to be the place where his freedom ended. But Carlson quickly discovered that prison walls were not as absolute as they appeared. He became fascinated with the idea of escape. At first, his methods were surprisingly simple. He did not have sophisticated equipment. He did not have some elaborate secret tunnel beneath the prison. Instead, he learned to make use of whatever was available. Sheets could become ropes. Ordinary objects could become tools. A simple weakness in a building could become an opportunity. Carlson became very good at noticing those weaknesses. His first escapes were not the work of a professional engineer, they were improvised. He observed, he waited, and when an opportunity appeared, he took it. But escaping prison created another problem. The moment Carlson got outside, he became a fugitive. The authorities knew his name, they knew what he looked like, they knew where he had been imprisoned, and they knew he would eventually need food, shelter, transportation, and somewhere to hide. Freedom was not simple, it was a race against time. Eventually, Carlson was caught and returned to custody. For most prisoners, being recaptured might have been enough to convince them to stop trying. For Carlson, it became part of the cycle: prison, escape, freedom, capture, prison again, then another escape, and another. During the 1960s, Carlson's criminal career became increasingly complicated. He was no longer simply a young man serving time for stealing cars. He was now building a record that included escapes and other offenses. At one point, he became involved in a major disturbance at British Columbia Penitentiary. The prison had a reputation for being harsh and difficult. Carlson was among prisoners involved in a 1963 riot in which guards were attacked and a hostage was taken. The event showed that Carlson's willingness to escape was not limited to quietly slipping away. He could become involved in much more serious prison conflicts. But the remarkable thing was that he kept returning to the same basic goal: freedom. Eventually, Carlson's escapes took him beyond Canada. He spent time in the United States as well. His movements between the two countries made his story even more unusual. Instead of being associated with one prison system, he became a recurring problem for several. One of the most important episodes happened in Vermont. Carlson was being held at the Burlington Correctional Center after entering the United States illegally. While there, he became involved in an attempted escape. He was later transferred to the State Correctional Center at Windsor, and then he escaped from Windsor too. He was captured 3 days later by authorities in New Hampshire and returned to Vermont. This particular escape is not just a story from a memoir, it reached the Vermont Supreme Court. The court records show that Carlson was convicted of escape and challenged the legality of his confinement. The court rejected his argument. Being unhappy with a transfer or believing his detention was unlawful did not give him the legal right to escape. The ruling was clear: Carlson was still in custody, and escaping that custody was still a crime. For Carlson, however, another prison sentence did not end the pattern. He continued escaping. Over nearly 2 decades, he broke out of custody again and again. His methods varied. Sometimes they involved simple improvisation. Sometimes other prisoners became involved. And sometimes the escape depended more on finding an opportunity than on overpowering the prison itself. One of the stories associated with Carlson involved a wooden imitation gun. Instead of having a real weapon, he used a carved wooden object as part of an escape. It sounds almost ridiculous. But the point was not necessarily the object itself. It was the ability to convince people that it was something dangerous. Other escapes involved makeshift keys, ropes made from prison materials, and carefully watched routines. Carlson learned that a prison did not have to be completely unguarded for an escape to happen. It only needed one weakness, one distracted guard, one poorly secured door, one opportunity, and he became skilled at looking for those opportunities. But each escape had consequences. The authorities became more determined to keep him locked up. His sentences increased. His transfers became more frequent. Eventually, Carlson was sent to the United States Penitentiary at Marion, Illinois. Marion was a high-security federal prison. It was built to hold some of the most difficult prisoners in the federal system. By this stage, Carlson was no longer an inexperienced teenager. He had spent years in prison. He knew how institutions worked, he knew how prisoners behaved, and he knew how security systems could fail. But even at Marion, escape was extremely difficult. Carlson would later describe life there in his memoir, Breakfast with the Devil. The book, published in 2001, became the main source for many of the stories about his life. It is important to remember that much of the detailed escape story comes from Carlson himself. That does not mean it should automatically be dismissed. But it does mean that some details are best treated as memoir rather than independently proven fact. Even so, the broad outline is supported by other records. Carlson really was convicted of escape in Vermont. He really did spend decades in prisons in Canada and the United States, and multiple sources describe him as having escaped custody 13 times. His publisher described him as a prison Houdini. The comparison was easy to understand, but there was one major difference. The legendary Houdini performed escapes for audiences. Carlson was escaping because he genuinely wanted to leave prison. And unlike a stage performance, there was nothing theatrical about what happened afterward. Police searched for him, authorities circulated information about him, and when he was caught, he returned to prison. Then the cycle started again. By the 1970s, Carlson had spent much of his adult life inside correctional institutions. He had experienced several different prison systems. He had seen violence, he had seen riots, he had watched other prisoners attempt escapes. And he had learned what freedom looked like from both sides of a prison wall. In 1976, he was returned to Canadian authorities, but returning to Canada did not end his escape career. He continued breaking out of custody, again and again. Eventually, the number reached 13. That number is what turned Carlson from a persistent escapee into a historical curiosity. 13 escapes from custody is an extraordinary number, but there is another way to look at it. Carlson spent much of his life trying to escape a system that kept putting him back inside it. Every escape gave him a temporary period of freedom, but every capture added another chapter to his criminal record. The more he escaped, the harder it became to obtain lasting freedom legally. And eventually something changed. Carlson began looking at his life differently. After decades of imprisonment, he started moving away from the life that had defined him. He eventually became involved in prison reform and programs supporting prisoners. He also began writing about his experiences. His memoir, Breakfast with the Devil, was published in 2001. It was not simply a collection of escape stories. Carlson also wrote about prison life, the people he met, the violence he witnessed, and the difficulty of changing after spending so much of your life inside institutions. The book helped turn him into a strange kind of public figure. He was still a former criminal, but he was also someone who had experienced the prison system from the inside for decades, and now he was trying to explain what that world was like. Then in 1998, after almost 4 decades of involvement with prisons, Carlson was finally released on parole. He had spent most of his adult life behind bars. He was no longer the 18-year-old who had entered prison in 1960. He was an older man. The repeated escapes were behind him. At least that was the idea. But Carlson's life still had one more unexpected chapter. In 2004, while on parole, he was arrested in British Columbia after police investigating a domestic dispute discovered that he was carrying a loaded handgun. He later pleaded guilty to illegal possession and was sentenced to 18 months in prison. Once again, the man known for escaping prison was going back into one. He was 62 years old. By this point, Carlson had spent roughly 35 years in prison. His life had become almost impossible to separate from the prison system. But this time, the story was different. He was not being remembered because he had escaped again. He was being remembered because he had returned to the system he had spent decades trying to escape. Carlson's story is sometimes presented as a simple tale of a genius criminal who could not be contained. That makes for a good story. But the reality was more complicated. He was not a fictional mastermind. He was a man who spent much of his life committing crimes, going to prison, escaping, being captured, and returning to prison. His escapes were remarkable, but they came with consequences. Every successful escape eventually ended. Every period of freedom was temporary. And the longer the cycle continued, the more difficult his life became. That is why the title, The Man Who Escaped Prison 13 Times, tells only half the story. The other half is that he spent decades being caught. He escaped 13 times, but he also spent around 35 years in prison. Freedom was always the goal, but it was rarely permanent. Carlson eventually became involved in prison reform work and support programs for people at risk of suicide. He also used writing to look back on the life he had lived. That is one of the most interesting parts of his story. The same man who had once been determined to get out of prison was eventually trying to understand why so many people kept returning to it. His life had given him a perspective very few people could claim. He had seen prison as an inmate. He had experienced the fear of being captured. He had experienced the excitement of getting away. And he had experienced the reality of returning. 13 times, he crossed that line between captivity and freedom. And 13 times, the authorities eventually brought him back. The exact details of every escape are difficult to verify independently, which is why claims about particular methods should be treated carefully. But the central fact is remarkably well established. Lorne Wayne Carlson became known for escaping from custody 13 times across Canada and the United States. His story was unusual enough to earn him the nickname Houdini. But unlike Houdini, Carlson's escapes were not entertainment, they were attempts to change his circumstances. And for years they did, just never permanently. Eventually, Carlson reached an age when the cycle could not continue forever. The young man who had entered prison at 18 had become an older man who had spent most of his life behind bars. The escape artist had become an author. The fugitive had become an advocate for prison reform. And the man who once measured success by how quickly he could get out eventually spent time trying to understand what had kept him going back in. That may be the strangest part of his story. The walls changed, the prisons changed, the countries changed, the guards changed, but the pattern remained the same. Carlson would find a way out, then someone would find him, and the prison doors would close again. 13 escapes later, the legend remained. But behind the legend was a much more complicated life. A life that began with an 18-year-old stealing cars in 1960 and ended with an older man looking back on decades of crime, prison, escape, and eventually change. He was not the man who escaped prison once. He was not the man who escaped twice. He did it 13 times, and every single time, freedom was waiting on the other side of the wall. The strange thing is that, for most of his life, Carlson seemed to believe that getting out was the hard part, but his story suggests something else. Getting out was temporary, staying free was the real escape, and that was the one escape he spent the longest time trying to achieve.